Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, I have an amazing guest with us. I wanted to welcome Michele Payn to the show. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you. I was saying to Michele prior to coming on, I have wanted to have her on the show for many years. But as you guys know, I used to do all the interviews in person. COVID hit, and this has given me the great opportunity to finally get you on because you're in Indiana, right?
I am, Tracy. Yeah. I am just northwest of Indianapolis, where it's very dry right now.
Oh, you guys are?
Yeah, well, the crops look great, but at this present time, it's dry. So we'll see what harvest brings. I think everything will be fine compared to last year.
Oh, boy. Sounds like us here in Manitoba, too. Okay, so for those of you, many of you will recognize Michele already. And for those of you who do not, I'm going to share just a few of her many titles and accomplishments. So Michele is a farmer. She's an author, she is a podcaster, she is a speaker, and she is known as one of North America's leading voices, an expert in connecting farm and the consumer, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I try to do.
I love it. And you know, that is not an easy task. So I am thrilled to have Michele on to talk about her newest book called Food Bullying and tagline, How to Avoid Buying B.S. So why don't we start with what is BS, bull speak? And can you tell us a little bit about yourself too, and then how the book came around?
Sure. Well, I think bull speak is a very natural word when it comes to food. It's better than the real BS, right?
Yes.
But really the reason why I wrote Food Bullying is because there is so much BS that's out there. Bull speak, that's literally on our food, that's out there about our food, that's out there about our farming practices. And through, I am a farm girl. I have owned and bred registered Holstein since I was 9 years old.
Wow.
And I love agriculture. I believe deeply in agriculture. And I also think that the future of agriculture requires us doing business differently. And that's understanding the perspective of the 1.5 or 2% of the population that's not on a farm or ranch. Mm-hmm. And so bull speak is about the marketing misinformation that's on the labels. It's about the non-GMO label. It's about the all-natural label. It's about the nasty activities that some of the activists like to do. It's about the bull speak that happens between farm groups. It's about the bull speak that happens between mom groups. And food bullying at its core is about basically manipulation and emotionalism in food. So by way of background, I grew up in southern Michigan, not terribly far from Canada. I've had the good fortune to spend my career in agriculture and have been a professional speaker for nearly 20 years now, and am now giving a lot of webinars as a result of the pandemic, and became an author back in 2013 when I released No More Food Fights. I've also written Food Truths from Farm to Table. And on a personal side, I think there's nothing more beautiful in the world than a registered Holstein cow. I really enjoy working with dairy cattle. I'm one of those crazy people. And I am married to a city slicker who gladly tells everyone when we go to the shows that cow business is women business at our place, because my daughter and I take care of everything. And of course, he helps, and he's a huge support system. But I do tell everybody that he's a city slicker, and I've had to explain a whole lot of things to him. And for example, cows do not sit, cows lay down, because he likes to tell me the cows are out sitting in the pasture.
That's kind of cute, though.
So yes, I have 2 adult stepdaughters who are grown and away from home, and have the joy of being the mother to a 16-year-old daughter, who I'm very proud of, but let's just say she's 16. But she too loves cows and is an FFA member involved in 4-H and an avid cross-country and distance runner and track. So I do a lot of mom things when I'm not traveling as well. And as far as other background information, I love wine, chocolate, and hanging out with my girlfriends. And travel when we're allowed to do that again. I really miss coming up to Canada, seeing Canadians, and working in other parts of the world as well.
So I'm not the only crazy that's missing farm shows and travel.
It's, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to connect virtually with people. I truly do, whether it be through interviews or through giving webinars. My livelihood depends on it, but it's just not the same. And it's hard not to shake people's hands. And, you can do this and this all you want, but it's not the same. And, I do feel blessed because I think since we live on a farm, so social distancing is a way of life for us. For example, when we were planning on going on spring break way back when COVID first hit in the States, I said to my daughter, we're going to have to be careful and just stay away from people. And she looks at me, she goes, and that's different than usual how? So, there are advantages. We live out in wide open green places and we get to go play with animals and work the land and do productive things. And we don't have to worry as much as others, but it's really hard not being out there live with people. And I look forward to the chance to do that again.
Me too. There's just something, exactly. You hit the nail on the head. There's something about getting out at farm shows. And I might be a little bit partial, but I just love farm people. They're just kind and like-minded, and it's so nice to be out and about at shows. And yeah. Anyways,
we digress.
I digress. I've been trying not to dwell on the lack of travel, but here we are. You know what? Blessings in disguise, because had COVID not hit, I'd be doing this show in person and I still would not be talking to you. So there's a blessing right there.
Well, I'm glad that we have the chance.
Yeah. Good. So why don't we jump into bullying? Really go into bullying. And I know myself and every farmer that's sitting in the audience, they're going to love this interview because, like you said, we're 2% of the population, I think it is. And where do you even start with this subject? It's so big and it's so personal. And sometimes it seems like you're fighting a little bit of a losing battle. And I'm sorry that came out that way, just so very negative, that I love your work and how you address this. And I would like to get you to speak to the players in food bullying and the victims. Can you touch on that?
Sure. And for everybody's reference, when I look down, I literally have the book in my hand because, as I said before the interview, authors don't necessarily remember 50,000 words when they write them. So to back up just a little bit, what I would encourage everyone who's listening and or watching to do is to think about how you would like people to view their food from an emotional standpoint, and to realize this is a population that likely hasn't been on a farm or ranch in the last 5 years. There's actually studies out there that clearly show that people haven't been in that situation. 75% of people in the States, as an example. Wow. So there's a distinct disconnect. And then you combine that with the actual food bullying playground. It's a $5.75 trillion business. And that's trillion with a T, just in case I'm not enunciating enough. And so that becomes very complicated. Agriculture is a part of that number. Does that mean we're bullies? Not necessarily, but we are sometimes, to each other in particular, I might know, which we can address later. And so when you look at it from a consumer standpoint alone, I think it's very complex to go into a grocery store. And here in the States, we have around 40,000 products in the average grocery store. If you figure 5 label claims on every product, that's 200,000 claims you have to sort through, whether you're going online and shopping virtually or whether you're in the actual store. 200,000 claims is too much. Nobody's brain can sort through that. So your brain basically sits there and spins and spins and spins, and the bullies prey on that confusion. They prey on that emotionalism. So if you look at the classic definition of bullying, it really is about fear, and it's about trying to leverage that fear that people have. And so we live in a society where people have been told that food is bad, farming is wrong, big is bad, small is good, local is good, anything from the States in your case is bad, and for us, anything from another country is bad. And none of those claims are necessarily true, but there's this constant barrage of misinformation being fed out in this $5.75 trillion playground. We, as farmers, lose, as do consumers, because we lose our choices. We lose the opportunity to choose when we go to the grocery store the most cost-effective food because the mom group down the street says that's the wrong food to bring. It doesn't have the right label on it. As a farm person, you lose the right to choose a particular herbicide because it's no longer available, a particular product that's a GMO product, or a particular animal care practice, in my case with dairy cattle. So the point here is that bullying preys on fear, and really when you look at some of the different players, it can be anyone from food marketers to retailers to farmers to dietitians to doctors and the like. And the victims are basically anybody who's out there making food decisions. And so we're all in some way victims of food bullying.
I thought you were going to say the farmer's a victim.
Sorry. So let me just address this one up front because I think it's really critical. And I'm trying not to point at people here because I get away with more in live than I do when I'm recorded. I know that. Have you ever condemned a fellow farmer or rancher who farms differently than you? And if we were to be honest.
Yeah, I just thought of one. Yeah. Yep. Okay, I'm on.
Yeah, and again, farmers, I'm not insulting you. I'm one of you. I get you. I love you. I respect you. However, we do not work together effectively. So let's just say hypothetically you farm, you use GMOs, and your neighbor farms organically. How many times have you trash talked the way their fields looked?
Yes.
And yes, I'm a little bug on your shoulder because I've heard the conversations. And likewise, I have dairy cattle and I like to trash talk people who have jerseys. That's in fun. But the point here is that farmers can be bullies too. One of the stories that I shared in the book and is actually on the Food Bullying podcast is with Ryan Weeks, who farms several thousand acres in Nebraska, farms a variety of crops, has transitioned half of his acres to organic, and has taken a number of insults from his neighbors that he grew up with that have known him his entire life because they don't agree with his practices. And to me, that's silly. I don't think that's a necessary or productive conversation that we need to be having as food producers because we need to be focused on the best environmental practices, the best animal care practices, and the best practices to build trust with the people who are ultimately making those decisions.
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
Share one that does bug me a little bit. Because sometimes I feel, just in the nature of marketing and trying to sell our own goods, we need to have that slogan. And I'm going to be thrown under the bus for this one, but local, for example. So people go to markets and sell their meat, their produce, and they say shop local. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think is a little bit frustrating where I feel our messaging between farmers needs to be consistent and together and not battling each other is I sometimes go, oh, why are you saying that? Because and here's where I'm being critical, but by saying your food's better because it's local, you're now positioning food in the grocery store as a poor choice because it's not. And I'm like, guys, can't we just work together and say nutritious farm-produced food? I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah, it's interesting. First off, I would recommend that you check out Local Boar's Dilemma. I forget when it's been published. It's been several years now, but I'm pretty sure one of the authors is Canadian. Great book that actually shows that local isn't always the best environmentally. They do the comparison, for example, between tomatoes that are raised in a greenhouse in the wintertime, say in our neck of the woods, where it's cold and clearly there's a great deal of energy. And they do the comparison of what it would take to ship those tomatoes in from, say, Mexico or someplace where they're grown outside of a greenhouse. And the longer distance tomatoes win environmentally, to be clear. Wow. And so what I call local, and to be clear, I have sold at farmers markets. I love going and picking blueberries locally, apples locally. I love local produce. I grow our own food when time allows. But local is difference without distinction. Because unless you're in a very specific region that has defined that, it's a label that doesn't necessarily have a federal mandate, whether it's Canadian or in the States. In the States, there is no definition of local. And when a food label is not defined, in my opinion, it's BS. Sorry.
I'm going to get you to jump into food labels too. I think I have that on my agenda for you. Anyway, I digress with that, but to me, that's just one way maybe where we attack ourselves within the industry. And I get it because I do like shopping local, but I could see how we even confuse people with our own terminology, right?
Well, sure. And I also like bananas, to be clear, but there will never be a banana in your life or my life that's local.
They're not grown in Manitoba, Canada?
I've been there. I'm pretty sure you don't have bananas growing.
Anyways, I digress. Carry on.
So you had asked about some of the different levels. So within the book, I actually have different levels that go up the chart. And it starts at zealot, and then it goes to full-blown bully. And so to give you an idea, the zealot is the person that subscribes to one way as the right way. For example, it's the person that says that they only eat organic and it's the only right way to do. And you are a bad parent if you are not choosing organic food. Mm-hmm. And then going to the judgers, and we all know the judgers, the people who judge those who do not make the same eating choices. And that could be a mother's school group who's no longer allowing one mom to bring snacks because they bring them from a generic selection versus Whole Foods or whatnot, to the evangelists. And I think that when you think of activists and you think of college students, activists handing out propaganda about how farmers abuse their animals egregiously are an example of evangelists that we can all relate to taunters, to shamers, which I think we clearly see, to full-blown bullies. And that can include physical threats, attacks through social media. I don't know if you've experienced any of those. I have. Excluding people from activities. So one of the stories in the book, and I worked really hard to include people from other countries, and there's a couple Canadians in here, but one of them, a story that I love and I don't love at the same time, is from a German dairy farmer. And I've actually had her on the Food Bullying podcast. And once you get through the language barrier, it's a really interesting story. She posted a picture of a child drinking milk on her Facebook page for her farm. She's a dairy farmer, to be clear. And the animal rights activists came after her with such vengeance that she took the post down. And she ended up creating an entire program that she shares with other farmers in Germany and Europe about how to stand up against the activists and what we have to do in agriculture to better overcome the bullies. If you're not a farmer and you're not aware and you're listening and watching this, you need to understand that there are activists out there that are presenting very real dangers on farms. I know in Canada you've had any number of folks that have actually entered people's barns and gone on farms, and I can't begin to tell you how wrong that is. I mean, my family lives here. This is my family home. Those animals are under my care, and no one has any business being on my operation unless I invite them to do so.
I know. When I heard about that, I just, would those activists want us on their yard and in their house? No.
Yes. And one of my early motivators in my career, when I went to Michigan State, my degrees are in animal science and agricultural communications. I wanted to work in international dairy genetics. Nothing like being a little self-limiting there, but live and learn. But the reproductive physiology laboratory that I worked in all the time that I was an undergrad was in our animal science building. And a year before I was to graduate, a very radical animal rights group actually tried to burn down our animal science building.
Oh, to save the animals, though, of course, right?
Interesting, the research that they did, well, there weren't very many animals, there were mice, but the research that they destroyed was the research in the building that used no animals whatsoever. And then a year after I graduated Michigan State, and I actually was living out in California, another group tried to blow up our agriculture hall.
Come on.
That is the most radical example outside of families being threatened that I can offer as far as the sheer bullying. That's what you wanted me to get to. I know, because you want to say that farmers are the victim. Well, in that case, they are. I mean, I live in fear of my family's safety because I know that the animal rights activists watch what I do. And I've had calls from a number of them. And that's perfectly fine. But we need to realize that we live in a society, particularly today, when people are stressed out beyond repair, and there's all sorts of racial tensions, political tensions between country, that people are at the cusp of doing horrible things. And we just have to make sure that we're protecting our rural families and respecting where people's families and places of businesses are. So, sorry, I didn't mean to get off on that.
No, that was good. You covered a lot of good stuff in there. I think the same thing too. I go, yes, you love your animals, but I can't put myself in a brain that would let animals go where they get run over or try and blow up a barn or try and harm people to save animals. I just wonder what is going on in their world. And you're right. I think people are really at that edge, and a lot of people are dangerous.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I wrote about in the book, and I'm trying to find the cycle, there it is, was the cycle of food bullying. And I clearly derived it from the cycle of bullying. And I do want to make sure that I pay verbiage to the fact that I did not write food bullying to make fun of bullying. I know what bullying is about as far as within the school system and with other kids. And I certainly respect that that's a major issue. But it is time to understand that we do have a bullying problem around food. And one of the things that I wrote about was the cycle. So when people are disconnected, as is clearly the vast majority of the population who haven't been on a farm and ranch, who don't live out in the country, when they're disconnected, they don't have that trust.
Yes.
And when there's not trust, then there's that fear, and the bullies always prey on the fear. I mean, those labels that are on your food or what people are telling you are because they're trying to prey on that fear and build that disconnect, which leads to more distrust, which leads to more fear, which leads to more bullying. I mean, it's a pretty vicious cycle. And if you look back over the last 20, 30 years, it's pretty clear that we have some significant issues. And I think the pandemic's offered an interesting challenge for us because, I used to stand in front of thousands of people and say, well, never in our lifetime will we see empty grocery shelves. I don't know what happened up north, but down here, and I will tell you, even as a person who is intimately familiar with the food system, it was terrifying to go to the grocery store and to see what that elicited. But I think that's the perfect example, a sad one, but of the fear, because, you could hold toilet paper up as the perfect example of food bullying.
I was going to say it, but I'm like, no, I won't do it.
So funny side note, my daughter in 4-H does cake decorating, and she built this beautiful dairy themed cake that included a round barn built out of sugar cubes, and it had a cupola on top, and in the cupola she put toilet paper and wrote 2020 on it.
Oh, really? I see your cake. I follow you on social media. Is that the one?
Yeah, that's the one.
Oh, wow. It looked fantastic. I'm going to go back to the pictures and look for the little toilet paper.
So anyhow, I digress. But we do live in a very different time, and addressing food bullying today is more important than ever before, not only because the farm economy is in such a uncertain time, but also because we have more consumers who can't afford food. I mean, it's time now to do something about this, more so than it ever has been before, because we have people who are terrified for their well-being. We have people who don't have jobs, and we have more and more people who are drawing on food banks and living with hunger.
Yeah, it's a crying shame. And I heard you being interviewed by another podcaster, and she was a dietitian, and you guys had a great dialogue about she mentioned that some of her patients coming in, I forget the name of the disease, but some people are so fearful of eating food because of these lies that they develop food-related diseases. Or there's poor mothers that don't want to feed their kids X because they're scared, but yet they're starving. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's been pretty clear that the Dirty Dozen, which is from Environmental Working Group and basically filled with lies, because the pesticide residue on this list of produce that you shouldn't eat is measured at a completely different level than the national standard. And it's a BS list basically, but studies very clearly prove that people who are on food assistance programs aren't buying produce because they're afraid to purchase it unless it's organic because they think they're going to harm their family.
Oh my!
That to me is incredibly sad. One of my favorite podcast guests on the food bullying podcast, and her story is in the book, is Diane Sullivan, and she is a formerly homeless mom, and she was homeless when she had a toddler son. You want motivation as to why this work matters? Right there it is. Because the more that we let the special interest groups bully regulatory concerns and bully label choices and bully people into believing that a certain label is the best, the more we increase food prices, which then decreases accessibility to the people who really need it. I mean, egg is a basic protein building block. And clearly what happened in California, Cornell's done a study that showed it increased egg prices nationally. So now people can't afford their food. That's essential. So to me, that's one of the saddest examples of food bullying. And there's examples you can offer from throughout the world, but that one really hit home.
Can you go back there a little bit? You cut out for 1 second. So there was a lady that was homeless.
Yes.
Pick that back up again?
Yes, I apologize. I live and work on rural internet in the States, which is a challenge. So one of my favorite podcast guests, and her story is actually in the book. Her name is Diane. She lives up in Massachusetts, and she is a formerly homeless mom who was homeless when she had a toddler son.
Okay.
And struggled with feeding him. And so what she brought up in her podcast interview with me was the study out of Cornell. And it's also in the book that shows that egg prices have increased because of the legislation that's happened in California and across the country about hen housing.
Okay.
And so as egg prices increase, fewer and fewer people that live in food insecurity or are hungry can afford a basic protein building block, an egg. So the challenge is the bullies by the special interest groups create more food prices through regulations, through misperceptions, through labels, and the like.
Okay, thanks. I really wanted to hear that story, and you cut out right at that moment. So thank you for covering that again.
Sorry, internet is a challenge here.
You know, I hear you too. I have the same problems at home once in a while. Okay, so the types of bullies, I'm glad you went over that because that is so neat. And I'm sure each of the audience members are thinking of people they know as you were going through that. And I'm going, oh yeah, that's so-and-so and that. Not that I'm judging. So I had a note here to ask you about hierarchy of food needs. I heard you mention that. Can you expand on that?
So this gets away from the barn and the field and into psychology. So if you go back to your basic psychology class, and I won't pretend that I remembered this until I wrote the book, but it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's that triangle or that pyramid that basically shows at the bottom is physiological needs. So health, food, and sleep. Like, I don't know about you, but when I don't get enough sleep, nothing else works, right? I'm not a nice person either. And then safety, which includes shelter and includes removal from danger. It's not living in fear. So that's the very basic. And then as you go up, there's belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So what I did was actually put the Maslow's hierarchy of needs on one side. And then on the other side, I came up with food buying needs. Because the point here is, particularly now, if we can get back to the physiological and safety, and I mean true food safety, not perceived safety. I mean definition, measurability, and those things that are regulated, not perceived. So what I always try to encourage people to do is to think about nourishment at the bottom. Is this food nourishing for our family? Hold on, I apologize. I have a frog in my throat. Is this food nourishing for our family? And then safety is the next one. Is this food safe? Because if you can answer the questions, is this food safe and is this food nutritious? You don't need to worry about anything else. It doesn't matter what the label claims it is. Because when you get back into the esteem and the belonging, I feel like Vanna here, but if you get back into these two levels, this is where you're most likely to be bullied at. Because when you consider tradition and altruism and activism as part of belonging, people seeking a sense of belonging, your Aunt Hilda may believe that she has the best cure from a particular cosmetics company because she sells vitamins. That's a sense of altruism. She's trying to do the right thing. You would never want to call Aunt Hilda a bully, but she kind of is. And I was dumbfounded by the number of examples, and I tried to include most of the examples that were fed to me by people that I knew and through social media, and there's quite some stories in there. But then the esteem one is where the prestige is. Well, I'm a better mother if I buy food from brand XYZ. Affirmation. Well, since I can afford this label, that makes me be more superior. Authority. When you look, Dr. Oz down here comes to mind. Food Babe was one in the past that comes to mind. There's Canadians as well. Think about those that are on preaching against modern day farming practices when they've never set foot on a farm and they don't have that firsthand familiarity. And then platform. And so one of the things that we talked about in the book was the implied power of position, platform, and product. And without getting into a bunch of mumbo jumbo, it's basically the people that are trying to sell a product. They are trying to build their platform, or they're in a position that brings implied power. For example, doctors. At least in the States, and I believe this to be true in Canada based on what my Canadian friends have told me, doctors typically have no nutrition classes. They certainly have no agriculture classes, but yet there are doctors out there who will talk against modern day farming practices and support a particular kind of food, which is their right, but as a medical professional, they come with that perceived power, that implied power. If you want nutrition advice, you need to talk to a registered dietitian, nutritionist. End of story. Those are the people that are the professional experts, and they have the information. And they should be the dietitian should be talking to farmers to get the food production information that they need.
The platform one, you just hit the nail on the head. Do you know how many big podcasters I listen to? I'm not going to name names on here. I'm sure they're not watching my agriculture show. I don't think they go out of their way to find facts. But you know how many platforms, just because, of course, they sell a commercial for whatever meat product, and now they are the expert on farming. I'm like, have you ever been on a farm? And there are people that have massive followings, like the biggest podcasts. And I'm like, what? Why? Stay in your lane.
Yes, it's very interesting. And throughout the book, what I try to get people to do is to think about their own food story, because the book does target consumers. But I can tell you that no agriculture person could read this book and not see themselves in here and better ways to relate to consumers and to connect with consumers. But at the end of the day, we all have a right to our own food story. And we all define our own food story in different ways. But all three of the books that I have written, every single one, I always say, go to the person with the firsthand expertise. And when it comes to food production, that's farmers and ranchers. Yeah. And if you're concerned about how your food is being produced, you need to be able to talk to farmers and ranchers.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, we could talk for hours on this subject. Our consumers, so many levels. I don't even, a good conversation with a girlfriend and you have a million things you want to say. I'm kind of at that point right now. But even my mom and her 10 siblings, they grew up on a farm. To listen to them talk, I hope you're not watching aunties and uncles. Love you dearly. But to listen to them talk, and I've said it to them too, to listen to them talk, you would think they have never set foot on a farm, and they grew up on a farm. So just imagine people with no connection at all, and how maybe that flips into my last part, speaking directly to the farmers. How do we help change this? Stop the food bullying.
Yes. So everybody says, tell your story. Well, that's great. I do believe in telling your story. I'm being a little sarcastic here. But sometimes it's stopping and having a conversation with somebody. So, for example, with your aunties and uncles, and I know this wouldn't necessarily be easy, but I often hear older generations who did come from a farm condemn modern day farming practices.
Yep.
Absolutely. And I don't know why that has to happen, but I also hear millennials condemn boomers. And again, we're all different. And that's fine. You know, peace is not necessarily about everybody agreeing. It's about getting along and playing in the same sandbox, as a meme I saw on Facebook this morning, you know. So part of it's engaging in the conversation. If you truly want to understand what your tomorrow looks like, find a person in a city that is the most different from you as you can possibly tolerate. And talk to them. And ask them, what do you think about farming? What's your perception of pesticides? How do you feel about meat? Depending on what segment of the business you're in, what's your perception of canola? You know, ask them some of the questions that you will feel really uncomfortable. But the technique that I stand before audiences and tell them is this, and it's really intense. You ready for it?
Ready.
So I bite my tongue.
Listen.
Yeah, we have to learn to listen. And that does not mean that we're agreeing with the bullies. It does not mean that we are being passive in this. It means that we are actually being smart enough to listen. And if you want to do a better job of connecting with consumers, it's about stopping, having those hard conversations, hearing their food stories, and realizing that you too have a food story. So one of the things that I shared in the book was my own personal food story. It was defined by milking 60 registered whole-seed cows in a comfort stall barn in southern Michigan. And I thought that place was the center of the universe. And it was also defined by being a teenage girl who heard some not very kind words that created some body image issues for me. And it was also created by all of these crazy worlds I've been in trying to connect farm and food. But that's my story. And I like to think that I'm more open-minded than what most of us in agriculture is, but it's really hard, even when I go to the grocery store. And if you ever have the unpleasant task of going to the grocery store with me, it looks like this, even before COVID, because I have to go as fast as I can so my brain can't engage. And so if we can know our own food story and we can listen, and the other piece is, and this gets really complicated, and this probably more than what you're looking for, is to help people understand their brains are being manipulated around food. One of the most fascinating pieces in the book that I have is around new neuroscience research that actually shows how brains respond to information about modern day food technologies. Dr. Tyler Davis down at Texas Tech University has a new research. It actually wasn't even published at the time that the book was put together in manuscript, but he was kind enough to make it publicly available. So he did an fMRI study, and fMRI is the pictures that show where the brain lights up. It's really cool. Believe it or not, we've only had fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. I think I got that right. And we've only been doing that for 25 years.
Okay.
It's a relatively new area of research. So he basically went through a series of questions around modern day food technologies, which included GMOs, sustainability, animal welfare, hormones, and I believe antibiotics.
Okay.
And he provided the participants with information and took pictures of how their brain processed that information. And so within the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's right behind your forehead, that's the prefrontal cortex, and just by way of reference, I may be a scientist, but it took me a month of studying neuroscience just to be able to explain a couple of paragraphs when I was writing this book about the study. Basically, the brain processes information in two different parts of the prefrontal cortex. There's the emotional part and there's the rational part. And so the rational part will process information and accept it. The emotional part of the prefrontal cortex processes and it fears, right? It's the reactionary one. So what food production technologies do you think fit into the rational and the accepted part of the brain? Meaning the brain was accepting it.
What food practices?
Yeah, so between sustainability, hormones, antibiotics, GMOs, and animal welfare, which of those do you think the brain accepted?
I don't even know.
So it was
my
really
brain's not processing today.
Well, I know, because when I say neuroscience, people are like, whoa. And it's amazing science. Like, if I had it to do over again, I would get 1 degree in agriculture, 1 degree in neuroscience, because I just think it's fascinating to see. Our brains are clearly being manipulated. Remind me to talk about neuromarketing after I explain this. So, long story short, his studies show that the brain processes information and is not fearful of sustainability and animal welfare, believe it or not.
Really?
Which I would have never guessed animal welfare.
That's what I wasn't guessing, because all of those, I'm like, the brain accepts any of them?
Yeah. So it's really interesting, because sustainability is one of those terms, and please don't get offended for anybody who's listening, but it's one of those squishy terms. You know, it lacks distinction because it's not definable. Everybody has a different definition, and my definition includes the economic well-being of farm families. Most people have.
I'm with you 100%.
Right. So, but sustainability is one of those things where the brain's like, oh, yes. And I don't want to say hug a tree, but you know what I'm getting at. and don't be offended, anyone. And then there's animal welfare. And it's really interesting to me that animal welfare fits in that. And I'm going to assume, and this is not proven in research, this is just from my years of looking at anthropomorphism, that because people associate with their companion animals, like all of our animal welfare, you know, is referenced by a cat or dog in most people's eyes. So if Fluffy and Fido can sleep on the house on the couch, why can't my 2,000-pound cow?
Yes.
Because there's logic in that. No, I'm being a little sarcastic here. But in any case, so the brain's like, okay, if we can relate it to animal welfare and sustainability, okay, we're good. Boom, information goes out. But GMOs, hormones, antibiotics, the brain goes, yee.
Really? Okay.
And continues processing. Yeah, it's a really fascinating study, and I'm probably not doing it justice, but I had been under the impression for years that we were having brain manipulation around food, and basically this study showed that there clearly is. And then so you couple that with neuromarketing, and neuromarketing is a phenomenon where basically marketers are looking at what the brain does with information and markets food accordingly. Think about health halos. Think about baby food with sunshine and pretty fields with baby playing with flowers in the field, and it's better because it has all these labels on it, right? That's the health halo, and it works clearly, and especially today when people want to feel good, right?
Absolutely.
And so neuromarketing basically goes as far as they've studied. I don't want to get it wrong here. I haven't looked at this for a little bit. They studied menus as an example, and they have shown that if a menu in a restaurant, you know, back when we used to go to restaurants, if a menu in a restaurant has the number 10 spelled out in the menu versus 10 and a dollar sign, people will spend more on their food.
Huh. Really?
I can't explain it. I've read the book. It's really interesting. The whole point here is whether you believe every piece of that or only a small part of it is clearly our brains are being manipulated. Our brains are being manipulated by the bullies, by the marketers. They're being manipulated, and we need to learn to be able to control them. And the best way to do that, in my experience, in my opinion, is building your own food story and knowing your own standards. So whether you're a consumer or whether you're a farmer, what I try to get everybody to think about are their own health, ethical, social, and environmental standards.
Okay.
And so one of my social standards is that I feel very strongly about is that people around the world deserve to eat. It's a driving passion of mine. I believe very strongly in it since I was a young girl, as most folks in agriculture do. But I also have traveled internationally, and I've worked in developing countries, and I've seen the eyes of starving children in South Africa, and it leaves an impression on you. And I've worked with farmers in Egypt that have both 1,000-acre farms and have plots that they farm with a horse or a donkey. And I wish I could get through to people that this food problem is so much bigger than what you see in your province or your state or your country. So that's an example of a standard that's a driving one for me. So as we build our own stories, we have to make sure that we have these standards in place, because what my contention and research shows is that if we have these standards, all we have to do when we go through the grocery store is, does this meet my health standard? Does it meet my environmental standard? Does it meet my social standard and such? Does it meet my ethical standard?
That's nice. It's like a life filter, a way to filter really quick, process your data, right?
Yeah, and I try to simplify it because I really think that's what we need. Because when you're going through the grocery store, again, 200,000 claims are impossible to sort through. And so I actually had to write down what my standards were just as examples. And it was really hard for me. But it was really very telling, because it also showed pretty clearly why I believe the things that I do. So my ethical standards is, I believe that animals deserve the best care possible, and I will do everything in my power to provide that, but they're not equitable or more important than humans.
Ooh.
And that is a distinction that not everyone would agree with.
No.
And I'm okay with that. I have cats, I have dogs, I have cows. None of them are my children. I didn't give birth to them. And that's different for me. And people will question me, well, you and your daughter clearly love your cows. And yes, they are pets for us. It's not like we have a real dairy farm or anything. But at the end of the day, we both know that it is an honor and privilege to care for those animals, but they're here to provide us with food. And those days where some of the show cows have had to be culled have been horridly painful. But it's still an honor and privilege to care for those animals. And ethically, as a person who owns animals, I would do everything in my power to make sure they never suffer. But they're still not more important than humans.
It's funny you say that. You're giving words to something I thought about. I often post, sorry to jump in there, Michele. I often post pictures and videos of the cattle in the pasture. We have a commercial herd on our farm here, purebred over at the other parcel of land. And I post on LinkedIn a lot, and just nice, not me talking, just videos of cattle grazing, sleeping on the pasture. And I post on LinkedIn, and it's become something that a lot of my contacts like. They're in the city, they're disconnected. That has become my advocating. Right. I still have not been called on yet by any haters and go, Tracy, if you love your animals so much like you do, how can you justify killing them? I'm waiting for the day for it to come. So it was so funny that you put that into words, because one day I'm going to have to explain that to somebody.
Yeah, and we should be proud of sharing that. That's part of our farm story. I mean, yes, part of my story is that animals die so we can eat. That's an ugly truth. But there's a lot of ugly truths on the farm, and that doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong. Just because you're out spraying chemicals in a field doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. You're actually doing the right thing to produce the most food possible economically. Yeah. But unless we take the time to explain that, unless we showcase our own standards. So, for example, what you're posting on LinkedIn, Tracy, is great because it puts a face and a context to how food is raised. Yes. One in which most people don't have. But yes, we have to take that a step further. So, for example, I always challenge everybody, for all of you that are listening and you have a smartphone in your hand, and I know you've got all those great pictures of your cattle or your pastures or your fields or your equipment and your tractors. So there's no reason why you can't click on Instagram, open it up, and add a picture and explain what's going on there. So, for example, I know you had Jolene as a guest. Jolene was just a guest on the Food Bullying podcast, and this is my Insta this morning that we posted about her podcast. My point here is that all takes about 10 seconds. And I know if you have fat fingers, maybe it takes 20 or 30 seconds, but we have to provide the story of agriculture by providing the context of why we do what we do that really showcase what our own standards are, because our standards and our food stories are very different than the rest of the world. But we are still ultimately consumers, and we just have to help other people see we're out here trying to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Okay, that is really good. In your book, you outline those standards, right? Do you get that template? Okay.
Yeah, I sure do. And I also give the 6 steps to defining your own story as well, which is more applicable to consumers. And then some information literacy types of, there's a lot more psychology in this book than what you probably will expect, but it's really telling to me. I think we have some opportunities in agriculture to use that science that we say we love in a different way.
I would love for our audience to pick up a copy of the book. And fun fact, we're going to be giving out a few copies as this episode airs. So make sure to sign up as an Impact Farming Insider if you want to win a copy. But I would encourage our audience to order a copy of Michele's book as well. Because I think more than anything, we as farmers need tools. And I think your book has a lot of really good stuff in there, food fairy tales and folklore and a lot of good stuff in there. But I want to ask you too, and coming from a farmer, I'm a communicator. I'm pretty confident. I speak a lot. I go out in public, so I'm not shy. But sometimes when people, I'm very fortunate, I have not been attacked yet, but I think there's a lot of people that are scared of having conversations, and rightfully so, because even myself as a farmer, I don't know all the facts and details about GMO. So what would you say to that farmer that says, I am scared of even opening my mouth, Michele? And then maybe a part 2, is there good resources for farmers to just browse and read to feel confident?
Sure. So my point to those of you who are a little reticent or hesitant about talking because you're afraid of getting attacked, you are the most stubborn person on the face of the earth, or you wouldn't be farming. So my question to you is, if you care about the farming practices that you have today, isn't it worth having a conversation to protect those for tomorrow? Because there's any number of case studies that I could cite, from pesticides to GMOs to fungicides to animal care practices that have been pushed to the wayside because of the pushback. So, number one, if you're out there in social media, are you ever going to have a negative comment? Probably. Will you live? Absolutely. And most of you will never experience at the level in which some of us have. If you choose to play big, you're probably going to attract some of the larger comments, shall we say. So from a very practical standpoint, what I always tell everybody is have a social media policy. My personal policy on my Facebook page, on my blog, and everywhere is that if you personally attack me, anyone else in the community, if you use swear words or if you are condemning a particular segment, I will block and delete you without apology. It's my page, it's my rules. And I do think everyone needs to have a policy to do that. But most people aren't going to have that experience. If you simply take 30 seconds a day to post a photo and explain why you're doing what you're doing, many people are going to love that because they don't have that window. I know you had Minnesota Millennial Farmer on here, and he was talking about, people just want to sit back and listen. So don't let the squeaky wheels scare you in sharing the agriculture conversation any more than you let the squeaky wheels scare you in agriculture. I mean, are you going to farm differently just because somebody doesn't like what you're doing?
No,
probably not. So this conversation is more important today than ever before, if for no reason than to protect your right to use certain practices and products than to protect your bottom line. because I know everyone out there is hurting. And I think it's really important for our mental health to feel like we're doing something productive and positive in these times. And I know personally, one of the best things that I can do is to make sure that consumers are getting the most affordable food that they can and sharing positive stories rather than the negative crap that's out there.
I love it. And, I think a lot of that is same thing, fear in our minds as farmers, right? Because look, I'm out there posting my show. I follow a lot of people, farmers, non-farmers. Nobody has really said boo to me, right? They like it because I'm giving them a window to what farming and what cows actually look like. Do those look like cows that are abused? No, their life is gold, right? And I think people appreciate that versus the pictures that people with other agendas have. So I agree.
If you live in fear, the bullies win.
Amen. Amen, sister.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I have really appreciated the time you've spent with us. This has been great. I am very excited to give away some copies of your book, Food Bullies. Yeah. And if anybody in our audience would like to order their books on their own, which I hope they do, how can they find you, your books, and your work?
Well, I am at causematters.com is my website, or you can look me up on social at Payne, and it's Payn speaker, SPEAKER. So Twitter, Insta, Facebook, you'll just look for Cause Matters, LinkedIn, and so forth. As far as getting the books, author-signed copies are available on my website. However, if you are in Canada, I feel the need to apologize because shipping is outrageously expensive. You can also order through Chapters Indigo up north, Powell's, BAM, Barnes & Noble, and then, of course, it's available on Amazon. And I've been told it's available on both sides of the border through Amazon. Authors don't make crap when you buy it that way, but I would love for you to have the material regardless. So there's lots of different options. And then also, if you are a podcast listener, which you probably are since you're listening to this, I check out the Food Bullying podcast as well.
Excellent. Okay, I think I'm ready to wrap up, unless you have any final words of wisdom that you want to share with the audience.
I just want to encourage everyone out there who is farming and facing harvest and the challenges and the economical problems to remember that you are doing the best job in the world and serving people in a way that so few people understand. So I want to honor that and say thank you. Really appreciate everyone in the agricultural community for trying to work together and to make for a better business for us all tomorrow. So thanks for having me.
Love it. Those were great words of wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us, Michele, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Impact Farming Show. If you like the episode, like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. See you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.